In the heart of the old African kingdom of Meroa, where dawn broke with drums instead of roosters, and the scent of palm oil and dust filled the air, there lived a servant named Leko. His hands were rough, his clothes were plain, yet his heart carried a peace that even kings could envy. Every morning, long before the first horn of the palace guards echoed through the sleeping streets, Leko was already awake, sweeping the wide stone corridors, fetching water from the well, lighting the torches by the gates so the early traders could find their way. He moved like a quiet rhythm, his feet almost whispering against the earth. Children from nearby huts would wave at him through the palace fence, and he would always smile back, a smile so warm that even the morning sun seemed to pause for a moment to greet him. The palace guards respected him, the cooks adored him, and the maids said prayers for him. They called him the heart of the palace, because he never shouted, never lied, never took what wasn't his. When others grumbled about their wages or the long hours, Leko simply wiped the sweat from his brow and said, "A clean day's work is a prayer." His kindness was not loud, it was quiet, steady, like the soft sound of a river flowing in the dark. But in every kingdom where light shines, there is always a shadow nearby. Among the other servants was a man named Banu, older, proud, and bitter from years of being unseen. He had served the palace longer than anyone else, yet no one ever spoke his name with affection. When the guards needed help, they called for Leko. When the king's horses needed water, Leko was the first to arrive. When a child from the village got sick, it was Leko who spent the night outside her home, whispering prayers until morning. And Banu saw it all. He saw how the people smiled when Leko passed by, how even the guards bowed slightly in respect. Each smile, each word of praise, felt like a thorn pressing deeper into his chest. He began to whisper to himself, "What makes this poor man so special? Why do they speak of him like he's a prince?" His heart, once proud, grew poisonous with envy. At night, while others rested, Banu would sit by his window and stare into the dark palace courtyard, watching Leko's silhouette moving under the moonlight, broom in hand, sweeping the steps. The more he watched, the more that jealousy grew, silent at first, then sharp, then unbearable. It was like dry grass waiting for a spark. King Moro, ruler of the land, was a man of power and pride. His kingdom stretched across green plains and hills dusted with gold, his palace built from red stone that caught the sunlight like a burning ember. The king's word was law, his smile, a blessing, his anger, a storm. Yet even he, with all his riches and glory, had begun to notice Leko. One morning, as he stood on his balcony overlooking the courtyard, he saw Leko helping an old guard tighten his armor straps. The king's face softened. "That boy," he said to his advisor, "has a servant's hands but a nobleman's soul." Soon after, he began asking about Leko, his family, his past, how long he had served. The queen herself once mentioned that the air around Leko felt calm, like standing beside a tree on a hot day. It was not long before the people of Meroa began speaking of Leko with the kind of affection reserved only for heroes and kings. In the market, mothers told their sons, "Be like Leko, work hard, speak gently, and serve with truth." The story of the humble servant spread faster than fire in dry grass. And though it reached the king's ears with pride, it reached Banu's heart with poison. One afternoon, while the sun burned high and the sound of drums echoed from the fields, Banu sat in the servants' quarters surrounded by others. He leaned forward, voice dripping with resentment. "Do you not see?" he hissed. "The king will one day forget all of us. He will make Leko a lord while we remain slaves." The others shifted uneasily, some nodding in quiet fear, others staring at the floor. "How can a man with nothing win so much love?" Banu continued. "He must have a trick, maybe a charm, or a spell." His words were venom, seeping into weak hearts. That evening, when Leko returned from his work, he noticed that some servants who once smiled at him now turned away. The air around him felt colder. But he said nothing. He simply went to the river to wash his face, watching the reflection of the fading sun ripple on the water. He whispered a prayer, let no man's jealousy change the kindness in my heart." Then he returned to his quarters, folded his hands, and slept in silence. Days turned to weeks, and Lecco continued to work as he always had, quietly, faithfully, like time itself. But deep within the walls of the palace, things were beginning to shift. The king, though proud, found himself thinking more and more about the servant who worked without complaint. He began to wonder if he had grown too distant from the people who served him. In the village, stories of Lecco's kindness spread until even travelers spoke his name at the gates. It was as if the kingdom itself had found a new symbol of goodness. Yet somewhere in the shadowed corridors, Banu's jealousy had ripened into something dangerous. He would stand behind pillars, watching Lecco pass, his fists tightening until his knuckles went white. Sometimes he would mutter under his breath, "A servant cannot shine brighter than his king." And so the stage was set. The palace, once filled with peace, now carried two fires, one of light, glowing softly within Lecco's heart, and one of envy, flickering darkly inside Banu's soul. Neither of them knew that soon those fires would collide, and the night that followed would change the kingdom forever. The days that followed carried the weight of something unseen, like a quiet storm gathering behind blue skies. In the grand palace of Meroa, drums still sounded at dawn, the cooks still filled the air with the smell of roasted yam and palm oil, yet beneath it all, an unease lingered. King Moro sat longer on his golden throne now, his mind troubled by whispers he could not name. Each morning, he watched from his balcony as Lecco moved about his duties, sweeping, smiling, helping others, and though his eyes admired the servant's devotion, his pride began to ache. "Why does this man's kindness draw more love than my crown?" he wondered. It was not hatred, not yet, but a quiet irritation, a thorn beneath royal skin. The queen noticed his distance and asked gently, "My king, what burdens your heart?" Moro's answer came with a sigh, "Sometimes I feel my people bow to kindness more than to power." She said nothing more, for she understood the dangerous place where pride meets envy. Meanwhile, Banu moved like a whisper through the halls, feeding the king's doubts with careful words. "Your Majesty," he murmured one evening as he knelt by the steps, "some say Lecco refuses gifts because he feels above the rest of us." The king frowned, not replying, but the seed had already found soil. Then came the day of the great festival, a celebration that painted the kingdom in gold and laughter. From the highest towers to the deepest wells, the people sang praises to their king. Drums thundered, dancers spun, and banners fluttered in the wind like colored fire. The courtyard overflowed with nobles, warriors, servants, and villagers who had walked miles just to witness the feast. King Moro sat on his high throne, his crown glittering under the sun, and beside him the queen smiled with quiet grace. When the time came for him to honor his most loyal servants, the king stood tall and called out, "Bring forth Lecco, the man whose devotion humbles my heart." The crowd erupted in cheers. Lecco stepped forward, bowing deeply, his simple tunic dusted with ash from his morning work. The king's voice rang out proudly, "From this day, I grant you gold, land, and a house by the river, for your service has brought peace to my soul." Applause filled the air, but amid the cheers, Lecco raised his head slowly and spoke in that calm, steady tone that always silenced the world. "My king," he said softly, "I serve not for gold or land. I serve because this palace is my home, and its people are my family." For a heartbeat, time stopped. The crowd fell silent, even the drums hesitated. The king's face froze in surprise, and for the first time in his life, King Moro felt a sting he could not explain. To him, those words, meant as love, sounded like rejection. In his chest, pride cracked like old stone. He forced a smile for the people's sake, nodding stiffly. "As you wish," he said, waving his hand. "You may go." The drums resumed, but the joy had faded from the king's eyes. That night, the palace that once buzzed with laughter felt strangely cold. Lecco returned to his quarters, unaware that his humility had been mistaken for arrogance. He prayed by the small oil lamp beside his bed, thanking the heavens for a king who had given him purpose. But outside, in the king's chamber, Moro sat alone by the window, replaying Leko's words in his mind, twisting them, shaping them into wounds. He whispered bitterly, "He refused my gift before my people, made me seem small in my own court." Pride, once wounded, can bleed into anger faster than fire consumes wood. By morning, his decision was made. Without anger on his face, without a word of blame, King Moro ordered that Leko be moved from the royal halls to the far edges of the palace, to mend walls, clean stables, and repair fences where no noble eyes would see him. When the guards delivered the message, Leko only bowed his head and replied, "As the king wills, so shall it be." He packed his few belongings, a wooden comb, a small cloth bag, and a prayer bead, and walked silently through the great courtyard. Many servants watched, some whispering in confusion, others looking away in fear. Only the queen, standing behind the pillars, watched him with quiet sorrow. And far behind, in the shadows of the courtyard, Banu stood with his arms crossed, a thin smile crawling onto his lips. The seed of jealousy had grown into triumph. The servant of light had been sent away from the palace heart, and in the silence that followed, a darker plot began to take shape. Banu's smile that night was thin, but it burned like poison. From the darkness of the courtyard, he watched Leko's figure disappear down the path toward the outer quarters, a lonely shape swallowed by the moonlight. The whispers of the other servants buzzed in his ears like insects. Some pitied Leko, others stayed silent, afraid to be seen defending him. But Banu felt a strange satisfaction growing inside him. He had wanted to see Leko fall, and now, at last, the palace that once adored that humble man no longer looked his way. Yet even as he savored his small victory, it wasn't enough. Envy has no end, it keeps asking for more, until it devours the heart that feeds it. Days passed, then weeks. Leko worked quietly in the far corners of the palace, fixing broken walls, scrubbing the moss off fountains, carrying buckets of water to the stables. He never complained. Even when the guards ignored his greetings or when the other servants avoided his eyes, he kept that same gentle tone, that same steady smile. Some nights, as he walked back to his tiny room by the servant stables, he would look up at the glowing palace windows and whisper, "May the king sleep in peace." But peace was nowhere to be found, not for the king, not for Banu, and not for the palace that had forgotten kindness. King Moro himself had grown restless. The same man who once ruled with warmth and dignity now felt the weight of his own pride pressing on him like a crown made of stone. He avoided looking into mirrors, for when he did, he saw not a ruler, but a man haunted by the silence of someone he had cast away. At night, he would walk to the balcony and stare at the empty courtyard below, wondering if he had done wrong, but his ego quickly whispered, "No, he embarrassed you. You were right." Pride is a cruel companion, it comforts you even as it poisons your soul. Meanwhile, Banu's jealousy turned darker. He began to imagine a world where Leko was no longer around at all, no quiet smiles, no kind words, nothing left to remind the palace of him. One humid night, while the moon hid behind thick clouds, Banu sat alone in the servants' quarters, staring at the flickering flame of an oil lamp. The thought came softly at first, what if a small accident happened? Then louder, more convincing. He could start a small fire near the old storehouse, just enough to cause panic. Leko, who often cleaned near that area, would surely be blamed. The king would never forgive such carelessness. It would be the end of him. Banu rose from his stool, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of the distant drums outside. In his chest, fear wrestled with hatred, but hatred won. The palace was quiet when he crept out. The guards dozed at their posts, and the night air carried the smell of dust and palm smoke. Banu moved like a shadow through the corridors until he reached the wooden storehouse behind the servants' wing, the one stacked with oil jars and spare torches. His hands trembled as he pulled out a small ember from a lantern, shielding it with a clay bowl. He whispered to himself, "Just a little spark, just enough to scare them." He placed it near the wooden beam and stepped back. The ember caught, the dry straw hissed, and within moments, thin orange tongues of fire began to crawl upward. Banu's heart pounded, excitement and terror tangled together. But the fire spread faster than he imagined. The wind picked up, feeding it. The dry curtains hanging nearby caught flame, and in seconds, the storehouse roared with heat. Banu froze, too frightened to move. Then came the shouts, first distant, then close. Guards yelling, servants running, buckets clattering. Smoke filled the courtyard, thick and black. The fire leapt from one hall to another, licking the walls, eating through wood and rope. Somewhere inside, King Moro awoke to the smell of smoke and panic. His guards tried to reach him, but a fallen beam blocked the doorway. The king coughed violently, trapped behind a wall of flame. Outside, chaos swallowed everything. And then, through the roar of the fire, Leko appeared. He had seen the red glow from his small quarters and had run barefoot toward the palace. Covering his mouth with a wet cloth, he pushed through the smoke, shouting for the guards to follow him. "The king! He's still inside," someone cried. Leko didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms in a wet blanket and forced his way through the burning hall. Sparks rained down on his back. The air was thick, choking, alive with heat. Through the smoke, he saw the king, coughing, slumped against a pillar, eyes half closed. Without a word, Leko lifted him onto his shoulder and stumbled toward the nearest window. The wooden frame cracked under the weight of the flames, but he broke through it with one final push, falling hard onto the ground outside. The guards rushed forward, pulling them both away from the blaze. The fire roared behind them, swallowing the palace walls like a hungry beast. For a long while, there was only noise, shouting, running, the hiss of water against flame. Then slowly, as dawn approached, the chaos quieted. The fire was dying. The palace, once proud and golden, now lay in ruins, its stones blackened by smoke. And in the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by ashes and silence, lay Leko, his hands burned, his breath shallow, but his heart still beating. The next dawn broke over a kingdom heavy with smoke and sorrow. The once golden towers of King Moro's palace now stood blackened and wounded against the pale sky. Ash drifted through the morning air like ghosts of the night before, settling on every rooftop, every tree, every grieving face. The courtyard, where laughter and music had once echoed during festivals, now smelled of burnt cedar and wet ashes. The people gathered there, some carrying buckets, some clutching children close to their chests, whispering prayers under their breath. And amid this quiet ruin lay Leko, the man who had carried the king from the jaws of death. He rested on a simple wooden bed under a white cloth awning, his skin marked by burns and his breath uneven. Healers moved carefully around him, applying cool herbs, changing bandages soaked in crushed aloe and river water. His hands, once steady and graceful in service, trembled as he reached for a cup of water. Yet, even in pain, there was calm in his eyes, that same calm that had always made him different. King Moro, wrapped in a robe of deep blue silk that barely hid his own injuries, sat nearby on a low stool. His face was streaked with fatigue, and his crown, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a burden pressing on his head. He looked at Leko not as a king looking upon a servant, but as a man haunted by guilt. After a long silence, his voice broke softly through the air. "Leko," he whispered, "after all I did to you, why did you save me?" Leko turned his head slowly, his cracked lips forming a faint smile. "Because, my king," he said in a voice dry but steady, "I serve goodness, not anger. I could never watch my king die." Those words pierced Moro's heart deeper than any wound the fire had left on his body. The courtiers who stood nearby lowered their eyes, some ashamed, some in tears. A heaviness hung over everyone, not of grief alone, but of realization. The king, who had let pride shadow his wisdom, had been saved by the very man he had cast away. For a moment, neither spoke again. Only the faint crackle of dying embers filled the silence. Then, from the edges of the courtyard, a young maid stepped forward. Her hands trembled, her face pale from fear. The guards tried to stop her, but she fell to her knees before the king. "My king," she stammered, "it was not Leko's fault. I saw Banu sneaking into the hall that night. He carried a small lamp. I thought it strange, but I said nothing. I saw him again when the fire began. He started it." A gasp swept through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. The king's eyes hardened. He motioned to his guards. "Bring Banu before me." Within moments, the jealous servant was dragged into the courtyard, his clothes scorched, his face streaked with soot and tears. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "My king, I only wanted to ruin Leko's name. I did not mean for the palace to burn. The flames, they spread too fast." Moro rose to his feet. His voice thundered, echoing through the ruined halls. "You fool! Jealousy burns faster than any fire. You set this palace, your home, aflame because you envied a man's goodness. You wanted to destroy Leko's name, but you have destroyed your own soul instead." Banu wept harder, beating his chest. The king turned away, struggling to steady his breath. For a long moment, he stood looking at the horizon, where the rising sun met the smoke curling above the trees. Then he spoke again, softer, but firm. "You will not be killed, Banu. That would be mercy. Instead, you will rebuild what you destroyed. You will live among the people whose homes burned because of you. You will work until your hands bleed and your envy turns into humility." 2 guards led Banu away. The courtyard fell silent once more. And in that silence, the people looked at Leko, frail, burned, yet radiant in spirit. A murmur spread among them, like the first breeze after a storm. They began to whisper his name, Leko, Leko the brave. Leko the true-hearted. King Moro turned to the healers. "Tend to him with all the care this kingdom can offer. His life is worth more than any treasure I possess." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "And when he wakes, I will make things right." Days passed, and slowly the smoke cleared from the skies. Workers rebuilt the palace walls with stone instead of wood. The river near the palace glimmered again under the sun, carrying away the ashes of the old. The people brought food and gifts to Leko's bedside, not out of pity but deep respect. Even the children, who once ran past him without a word, came each morning to see if he would smile at them again. Inside the royal chambers, King Moro could no longer find peace. Every time he sat on his throne, Leko's words echoed in his head, "I serve goodness, not anger." The king realized that for years he had ruled with pride, expecting loyalty to be earned through fear or gold. But Leko had taught him something no war, no counsel, no victory could teach, that true loyalty comes from love, not command. So one morning, when the palace bells rang to announce the new moon, the king gathered the people in the courtyard once again. The ruins had been cleared, garlands of palm leaves hung from the pillars, the drums were silent, waiting. The king stood before the crowd, his voice solemn but strong. "My people," he began, "a fire destroyed our palace, but it also burned away our blindness. I was proud, and my pride made me foolish. I sent away a man whose heart was purer than gold, yet when the flames rose, it was he who saved me. He gave me life when I gave him pain." The crowd murmured, many nodding, some weeping quietly. The king motioned for Leko to be brought forward. He walked slowly, still weak but steady. When he reached the center, the king removed his crown and placed it on a wooden stool between them. "This man," the king continued, "refused my gifts of gold and land, but he gave me something greater, faith. From today, he shall no longer serve as a mere worker in this palace. He shall be known as Leko, the true heart of the kingdom." The crowd erupted in cheers. Drums rolled, voices rose, and for the first time since the fire, joy filled the air again. The king lifted Leko's hand high for all to see. "Let every child learn his story," he declared, "for it is not riches or titles that make a man noble, it is the purity of his heart." Leko's eyes filled with quiet tears. He bowed his head and said softly, "My king, I am but a servant. If you wish to honor me, then let me serve your people, not as a man above them, but among them." The king smiled, humbled. "Then so it shall be." And as the drums thundered once more, the sun broke through the clouds, not as a witness of ruin, but as a promise of renewal. As the sound of drums faded into the afternoon breeze, the celebration gave way to something far deeper, reflection. The fire had burned the palace, yes, but it had also stripped the kingdom of its illusions. For years, King Moro's people had believed that greatness came from thrones and jewels, from silks and swords. Now, as they watched a humble servant being honored not for wealth but for heart, they began to see the truth that had lived among them all along. Leko became not a symbol of power, but of goodness itself, a reminder that kindness, once set aflame, spreads faster than envy ever could. In the days that followed, King Moro changed in ways no one could have imagined. He no longer rode through the market surrounded by guards. Instead, he walked among his people, unarmed and listening. The first time he visited the marketplace after the fire, the traders fell silent, expecting him to command or to boast. But instead, he smiled gently and asked, "What do you need most?" One old woman, her hands scarred from working the fields, said, "We need roofs that don't leak, and fields that drink when the rains forget us." The king nodded and said, "Then that is where we will begin." From that day, he ordered the rebuilding of the villages before the palace walls. He cut the gold meant for royal banquets and used it to dig new wells, repair farms, and build homes. And at every step, Leko was by his side. Though still healing, Leko refused to rest. Each morning before dawn, he would walk with the workers, his burns hidden beneath a loose linen robe, his voice gentle but firm. "The king's gift is not his gold," he would tell them, "but his change. Help him build with your hands, and he will build with his heart." The workers followed him, inspired not by his words alone but by the quiet strength behind them. Even the children began calling him Uncle Leko, running to him with water jars and small smiles. His humility, once mistaken for weakness, had become the pulse of the kingdom's rebirth. King Moro watched all this with awe. Every evening, as the sun melted behind the distant hills, he would sit beside Leko on the unfinished palace steps and listen. "How did you stay so pure?" he once asked. "How did you serve when the world gave you nothing?" Leko thought for a long moment before replying, "When I was a boy, my father told me that every act of service is a seed. Some grow in soil, others in hearts. I only wanted to plant good seeds, Your Majesty. What they grow into, that is not for me to decide." Those words lingered with the king for the rest of his days. He began to rule differently, not with commands, but with questions. He would call the farmers, the guards, the traders, even the beggars to his court and ask, "How can I serve you better?" At first, people were too stunned to answer. No king had ever spoken like that. But slowly, honesty replaced fear. The farmers asked for tools, the guards for fair wages, the widows for food. And as each request was met, the kingdom began to heal. Meanwhile, far beyond the palace walls, Banu lived among the ashes he had created. The king had kept his promise, exile, not death. He worked rebuilding homes by the river, his hands blistered, his spirit heavy with regret. At night, when the stars filled the sky, he would sit by the water and stare at his reflection. Once proud, now broken, he whispered to himself, "This is what envy does, it burns the soul first, and the world after." The people hated him at first. They spat at his feet, called him the fire maker. But Banu never fought back. He bowed his head and kept working, carrying heavy stones, rebuilding walls one by one. One evening, months later, Leko came to visit him. The villagers watched in silence as the servant-turned-hero approached the disgraced man. Banu dropped his tools and knelt, trembling. "You should hate me," he said, his voice cracking. "You should have let me burn." Leko placed a hand on his shoulder, his tone calm but unyielding. "If I had let you burn, Banu, what would make me different from you? Fire teaches, if we listen. You destroyed what you envied, but now you are rebuilding what you understand. That is how you atone." For the first time, Banu looked into Leko's eyes and wept without shame. "Can a man like me ever be forgiven?" he asked. Leko nodded slowly. "Forgiveness is not given by kings or gods. It begins when a man no longer runs from his own truth." From that day, Banu worked with new purpose. He stopped hiding his shame and began helping the villagers with quiet dedication. Word of his transformation reached the king, who, after a long silence, said to his council, "Even ashes can become soil." He allowed Banu to return to the palace, not as a servant, but as a teacher for young workers, to guide them away from jealousy and pride. It was a mercy few kings would have given, but Moro was no longer the king he once had been. As years passed, the kingdom flourished again. The palace stood rebuilt, not as a fortress of pride, but as a symbol of humility. Its walls bore murals of the Great Fire, of Leko carrying the king through smoke, of Banu rebuilding homes. Every visitor who entered the Great Hall was reminded that honor is not inherited, it is earned through compassion. The people lived simpler lives, but fuller ones. Markets thrived not in gold but in laughter. The king's table was open to all during festivals, and each year, he would raise a cup and say, "To those who serve not for reward, but for love." In his later years, when Leko's hair had turned silver and his steps slower, the king often sought his counsel in moments of doubt. "You taught me how to rule with my heart," Moro once said, "but what if the heart falters?" Leko smiled, his eyes soft with wisdom. "Then listen to your people, their heartbeat will remind you of your own." The two men sat together in quiet friendship, the king and the servant who had once swept his floors. There was no distance between them anymore, no titles, no pride. Only understanding. When Leko eventually passed away in his sleep one dawn, the bells of the kingdom tolled not in sorrow, but in reverence. The king declared 7 days of silence, no music, no festivals, only the sound of wind passing through the palm trees. He ordered a statue to be built by the river where Leko once fetched water, its base inscribed with simple words. He served not for gold, but for goodness. He gave his heart, and it became our kingdom's soul. Years later, when King Moro grew old and weak, he would often walk alone to that statue, sit beneath its shadow, and whisper, "You saved more than my life, Leko. You saved the meaning of it." And when he, too, was gone, the people kept their story alive, not in scrolls or songs, but in the way they lived. They helped the poor, forgave the fallen, and taught their children that true power lies not in ruling others, but in mastering oneself. For generations, the tale of Leko, the true heart of the kingdom, echoed through fireside nights and marketplace mornings. And every time someone spoke his name, the wind seemed to carry it softly across the land, a reminder that one man's goodness can outshine 1,000 crowns.